This is my very own Proton Iriz from 2020. It's coming up to 2 years old now, and it's about time that I do a long-term review of it. I know a lot of you have been asking for it, but I'm sorry, I haven't really had much time to do it until now. And yes, I also do long-term reviews of my Proton X70, which is now coming up to 3 years, as well as my 1-year-old X50 very soon. So in this video, I'm going to tell you what I like, what I don't like about this particular Iriz, and I just so happen to have the latest version on the right. So I'll tell you what Proton has improved on and what they haven't. So if you're looking to buy an Iriz in the future, whether you're looking to buy a brand new one or a used one, this video should be very useful to you. Let's go. I've always had a soft spot for the Proton Iriz. It was launched way back in 2014, coincidentally on my birthday. But back then I already had a manual hatchback, a Fiat Bravo T-Jet in my garage, so I didn't need an Iriz way back then. And then in 2016, I changed the Bravo to a Peugeot 208 GTI, also a manual. So again, I really didn't think of the Iriz until 2020. With the X50 SUV coming out, I wanted to trade in the Peugeot. So now I had a hole in my garage for a manual car, and this came in perfectly because I always want to own a manual car for as long as I can. This at the price, I only paid 35,000 ringgit for it, so it was perfect. The price was good, it drives very well, and better than that, it was available with an immediate delivery. More than that later, because obviously I chose a manual version. Now let's talk about styling. The Iriz have had quite a few design changes through the years, and this being the 2019 facelift, unfortunately, I now have the worst looking version. I've always thought the original version looked a lot better than this. Plus, the headlamps have gone through a downgrade in this version, moving from projector halogens down to reflectors, plus the whole fully rounded bumper doesn't quite sit right with me. I've never been a fan of this funny looking grille either. At the time, I would much prefer to have the look of the 2019 Persona on the Iriz instead. Now this is where I think Proton has made great strides with the latest Iriz facelift. The headlights have finally moved on to LED technology, and the much sharper, edgier look of the bumper fits the whole shape of the Iriz far better than before. I'm also a big fan of this X50 inspired front grille with the red highlights. I think that is a nice touch. Say all you want about this semi-crossover look of this Iriz Active, but I think it works really well for the Iriz. Has kept it looking fresh even 8 years down the road, which is more than you can say about cars from the similar era. Cars like the Proton Exora, the Proton Iriz, the Toyota Avanza, all tired looking cars, this still looks good today. It helps that the Iriz was far ahead of its time even back then. For instance, it uses Aero blade wipers way back in 2014, which was very new at the time, so it doesn't feel like a dinosaur today. And then you've got the A-pillar design with a small quarter window look, which gives it fantastic visibility from the inside, especially with the side mirror that's mounted on the door rather than on the pillar. To me, I've always thought that the Iriz have had very sound core fundamental design from the very beginning. I've always been a huge fan of the side blades on the bottom. It still looks very striking, very unique to this day, which makes it far more interesting overall than, say, a much plainer looking but newer cars like the Proton Myvi. The back is perhaps the Iriz's most controversial look because it's a very unique design. You don't see it on any other cars on the road. It doesn't even look like any other Proton either. I find it surprising that Proton has not made any big effort to revamp the rear end, because the taillights, the spoiler, and pretty much the tailgate is identical to the launch version back in 2014. Even the third brake light is the exact same bulb unit from the launch version, which is extremely lame in 2022. Now, speaking of the spoiler, this is pretty much the only thing I added to the car, well, other than the good set of tint and body coating, because I've always thought the standard look with no spoiler looked a bit too botak. Now, I initially wanted the more slimline look of the small rear spoiler back in the launch version, but unfortunately that is no longer in production, so I gotta make do with this larger version. The only thing I really don't like about this car's exterior is the panel gap in the back here on my particular Iriz. It was delivered like this with a huge gap in the back here, and I complained about it, but unfortunately there's nothing much they can do about it, so I gotta live with this. The car in the back there has a much smaller gap, so I'm not sure why mine was left like this. So yeah, perhaps Proton QC needs to be improved a little bit. Well, maybe it has, because the new car doesn't have this anymore. Moving on inside, and this is where I suppose you'd think I'd have a lot of things to complain about in terms of interior rattles and whatnot, but unfortunately I have very little to report. The only rattle that this car has developed over the years is a small little noise from the back of the dashboard over here, which comes on and off depending on the time of day. All I have to do to fix it is press on the dashboard a little bit, and yeah, the sound will likely go off. Beyond that, the interior has held up very well over the 2 years, considering this car has mostly been parked outdoors under the hot sun every single day. Nothing has fallen off, nothing has become looser. Well, the aircon controls are still as loose as before, but like I said, it did not get any looser. And truth be told, I can honestly say the interior feels just as new as it did 2 whole years ago. But obviously it's not quite perfect, because I do have quite a few complaints. Number one is the power window. It still works, of course, but it is very loud. Listen to this. Yeah, we hear that judder at the end. I'm not sure how long this will continue working. But at the end of the day, even if it breaks, it will still be covered by a warranty, the beauty of buying a brand new car. And number two is the typical, or rather the characteristically loud condenser sound from the aircon. This is something you'll see in pretty much all Protons from today. It turns on and off with a very loud tick. It gets annoying once in a while. It's something you just have to get used to, I guess. And then there's the steering wheel. This being the standard version is not covered in leather. This is fully polyurethane, and just over 11,000 kilometers. It's already gotten slightly slippery, slightly shiny. I will have to cover this in leather very soon. My biggest gripe, however, is this head unit over here. This has this really ugly touch operated system for the basic car, but the biggest offender is this shiny glossy sheen on the screen itself, which makes it really hard to see in certain lighting conditions. This is horrible. I cannot wait to change it when the warranty ends. But that does not mean that I don't like the interior at all, because overall I actually love this car to bits. Number one, the seats are supremely comfortable. They may not look like much, rather small, rather narrow, but to sit on, they are extremely comfortable over the long run. It's all very supportive in all the right places. It's just a nice length at the bottom as well. Gives you nice support on the side when you go through corners. I think these are one of the best seats in the class today. Definitely much better than the super flat ones on the Proton Myvi. Paired together with sitting position that is just absolutely perfect, this really puts you in the right mood to go for a drive. This is a car that you look forward to driving, rather than a car that you just drive because you have to, like what the Myvi is. And of course, it goes without saying, the aircon is pretty much the best in the world. Driving around in this, I literally freeze my fingers off. This is partly due to the weird positioning of the aircon vents, where it blows directly to your fingers rather than straight to your face. Now, this has been fixed completely in the facelift version, where the vents have been moved further down to a much better position. The aircon controls have been completely overhauled as well. Out goes all these loose knobs, replaced by a much nicer set of toggle buttons inspired by the X50. That, together with a much more modern looking center console with the built-in armrest, makes the whole interior feel a lot better, a lot fresher than this. If you put it side by side, the new and old, man, I'm such a jealous Iriz owner right now, because it's amazing how much Proton has improved the interior by just swapping out small little bits here and there, by still using the exact same bones as before. The transformation is amazing. With the new car's fancy big screen, glossy surfaces everywhere, and AMG style bright red seatbelts, that is as stylish as cars in the class can get. In the back here, I think it's obvious to see that Iriz isn't quite as strong as its main rival, the Myvi. Legroom for me is just about okay, and as you know, I'm not a very tall person, only 167 centimeters tall. So if you're much taller, say 180, you will struggle to sit in the back here for longer than say a 20 or 30 minute journey. Having said that, however, the seats themselves are exceptional. They are soft, they are comfortable, they are very supportive in all the right ways. So to me, I think this is a good compromise versus the less comfortable seats in the Myvi but with more space. Here, I think it feels better for me, for my size. Unless you are constantly fitting very tall adults in the back here, I think you don't need the bigger space offered by the Myvi. It's nice to have, obviously, but you don't really need it. To me, I much prefer sitting in the back of the Iriz than say a much bigger space but less comfortable seats in the Myvi. The same goes with the boot as well. The Myvi is quite significantly more spacious and much more practical than the Iriz, but to me personally, for everyday or even weekend use, the Iriz isn't too bad. It should be enough for all your necessary requirements. So if you're looking for the most practical car in the class, that is obviously the Myvi, but that is not to say the Iriz is small either. As a benchmark, it's already bigger than the second generation Myvi, which was the car the Iriz was designed to go against in the first place. Before I start talking about how this car drives, a quick disclaimer on this car's mileage. It has only done just over 11,000 kilometers over 2 years. Now, this is not my primary car. It's not even my secondary car. It's just a car I drive once in a while to, have a little bit of fun, feel a bit younger than I am. It's just that kind of car. But having said that, 11,000 kilometers may not sound like a lot, but tell you what, those are 11,000 very hard miles. Now, obviously, I've driven a lot of cars over the past 2 years, but this car has kissed the red line way more than all the other cars combined. It is just that kind of car. It really puts you in the mood to go a little bit faster, just press the throttle a little bit more than in most other cars I've driven. That, I think, is this car's strongest point. You'd buy a Myvi because it's very well priced, because it's very practical, and it's got all the specs that you need and want. But you buy an Iriz because of the way it drives. Borrowing Proton's old tagline, it's in the drive. Or even better still, Toyota's current tagline, it's all about the drive. Proton has built up quite a fair bit of reputation, both positive and negative, across the past 10-20 years. But the one thing that most people will agree on is its famed ride and handling. Nobody does it better than Proton in this price range, and the Iriz together with the Proton Privé from 2012 are the two star examples of this. Because in terms of ride and handling, this car runs rings around the Myvi, both the second generation car this car was designed against and even the newer, much more modern third generation model. The Iriz is just that much better in pretty much all aspects. Let's talk about the steering first. The Iriz had one of the earliest versions of electronic power steering back in 2014, but even then, it is one of the better ones out there. It's not overly light. It doesn't require you to have multiple adjustments as you drive along on the highway. You compare this against an early EPS from say a Kia or a Hyundai from the early 2010s, this is on the complete opposite end of it. Now, those have been extremely light, extremely vague, whereas Proton nailed it from the very beginning. This is a massive achievement for Proton engineers, I think. And then we move on to the chassis, where I think Proton absolutely nailed the core fundamentals of this car. This chassis is built very long for the class. It's got a long wheelbase compared to its competitors, and it's also made extremely wide and squat as well. That gives it quite a few advantages in terms of ride handling. For one, the long wheelbase gives it that famed big car feel as it goes through potholes and rough roads. Now, this is something that the Iriz has a massive advantage in compared to the Perodua Myvi. If you ever get a chance to drive these two cars back to back, the Iriz and the Myvi, in terms of ride and handling, you will feel that the Proton is a much more accomplished, much better engineered car overall. This car's ride comfort is perhaps Proton's biggest achievements over the years, I think. This being a small, cheap, affordable car, it rides like a much more expensive vehicle. I've mentioned this many times before in my Proton reviews, but it really does hold true. It does not feel like a lower-end Japanese car. It feels like a much more sophisticated European car in terms of how it drives and rides. Pair all that together with the supremely comfortable seats that I've mentioned before, and this is a really nice car for everyday drives, even compared to the Perodua Myvi. The Myvi may have a lot of advantages in other aspects, but to drive, to sit in, the Iriz is where it's at. Now let's move on to the engine and the transmission. The engine has not changed from the very beginning of the Iriz back in 2014. It's the exact same 1.3 litre VVT engine, and it only makes 95 PS and 120 Newton meters of torque. Those are not very exciting numbers. But in this case, it's paired to a 5-speed manual transmission, and the combination of those two is quite exciting. It's by no means a fast car. You really have to rev the hell out of this engine to actually go quickly, but the experience of doing that is very extremely fun. I think by now most of you would have had some experience with Proton's CamPro, CPS or VVT engines. So the latest VVT version, well, I shouldn't say latest because it's actually a very old version, but still, it is no longer as peaky as the early CamPro versions. There's no more of that infamous torque dip from before. But overall, this is still a highly strung, revvy engine overall. So if you get stuck under, say, 2,500 RPM, you're in no man's land. You are forced to downshift and ride the higher torque in the higher rev range. So that fits perfectly well with this being a manual transmission. So as soon as you want a little bit of an acceleration movement, you gotta shift down, and that's the fun of it really, because the transmission is really nice and snappy. Now compared to a Myvi with a manual transmission, this is a far better manual gearbox. The clutch is not as spongy, it's nice and linear in feel, and the shift action itself is really crisp. It's a right combination of snappy, crunchy, and a little bit of rubberiness as well. If I were to rate this 7 out of 10 overall, which I think is fair, the Perodua Myvi manual would be a solid 3. But in the end, that is all a moot point because Proton no longer makes a manual Iriz because, well, nobody bought them. Now I know what you're thinking, people are not buying manuals because they only make it on the lowest end, but to counter that point, Proton did make a highest end premium 1.6 manual before, but again, nobody bought them, so that was dropped very early on. It's the same thing with Perodua as well. At one point they did make a Myvi SE manual. Nobody bought them, so that was quickly dropped. And now both players have completely dropped out of the manual game for this class. It's a bit of a shame, but the only people we have to blame are Malaysian buyers themselves. We didn't buy enough of them, there's no demand for it, so obviously they stopped making them. I bought one, did you? So now both models, the Proton Iriz and the Perodua Myvi, are only available with a CVT gearbox, which to purists may sound like a bit of a shame, but I guess to consumers, that is the right way to go. So those of you who have always been skeptical of Proton CVTs, now the main rival Perodua have also gone the same route. So you can sort of say that Proton got it right all along. Now obviously both CVTs have very different characteristics. They don't all feel the same, but to most people, a CVT is a CVT. So now there's pretty much no difference between the two. So where before you wouldn't buy an Iriz because it has a CVT, now the Myvi's got a CVT as well. So yeah, which way would you go? Now back to the engine, which I think is a major differentiator for the Iriz, because it is actually a sweet little engine. It is very revvy. It's quite a refined one as well. Anything below say 4,000 RPM, you'll hardly ever hear the engine, which is more than you can say about the Proton's extremely loud engine. But having said that, the Iriz is notorious for having very short gearing. So even in a manual transmission, which has longer gearing compared to a CVT, at 110, you're already pushing well beyond 3,000 RPM. So for cruising, it always feels like the car's a little bit more stressed than it really should be. That's one of the biggest things I don't like about this Iriz, the very short gearing. I suppose in lower speeds it does give it that short burst of acceleration, but as soon as you hit the highway, by the time you reach 110, the car's already feeling like I wouldn't want to go much faster than this. I think the Myvi feels a lot more relaxed on the highways. But then again, I didn't buy the Iriz for long distance journeys. I bought it to have fun in the corners, and there it is exceptional. The one thing that sort of holds the Iriz back a little bit are the standard tires. This car runs on some Silverstone thing, whatever the model is. These are not very good tires. I guess there is a bit of fun to be had in having tires that have such low threshold. So as soon as you go into a corner with a bit of verve, there's a lot of complaints coming from the tires, a bit of tire squeal. It does make you feel like you're a bit of a superhero, right? You're right at the limit of the car and the tires. But as soon as it starts raining, I'll bring the Iriz down to a crawl because I'm so not confident of the tires' wet weather performance. I will definitely change the tires to something a lot better very, very soon. Now let's talk about fuel consumption, which is extremely important for a car of this size and in this price class. Over the 11,000 kilometers, I have averaged around 7.5 liters per 100 kilometers with this Iriz. Now that is not exceptional in any way, but remember, I've driven this car hard. The few times that I drove this car like a normal person, very slow, according to traffic, I would have gotten about 6.5 to 7 liters per 100 kilometers. Again, not quite as good as a Myvi that will happily do 6 liters per 100 all day long. This is about 10-20% more, but in the long run, I don't think that makes that big of a difference. Like say you spend on average 300 ringgit per month on the Myvi for fuel. With this car you'll spend maybe 330, maybe 350. Yeah, it doesn't really sound all that much of a difference in the long run. For me, I will happily, gladly pay the extra 50 a month to enjoy this car's ride and handling. Now lastly, a quick note on refinement. Because the engine is revving very, very high up, 3005, maybe 4 if you're pushing it, it does feel quite loud in here when you're cruising. In this department, the Myvi will be a much, much better car. But at the same time, Proton has also made vast improvements in this department for the facelift version. There's a whole lot less vibrations and NVH is a lot better at higher speeds in the facelift compared to the pre-facelift version that I have over here. You won't really feel it if you just drive the new car, but if you drive the new car and the old car back to back, you will really see the difference. There's a lot of things that Proton has done to the new version to make it overall slightly better than before. Even the ride and handling, which I've absolutely loved in this one, has been improved slightly on the new version. The biggest difference are the wheel options, of course. This car rides on 14-inch wheels, which does give it fantastic ride comfort, whereas in the new ones you can have it at up to 16-inch wheels. Now usually if the only change is the wheel and everything else is left untouched, you will have a much stiffer ride comfort overall, but Proton knows better than that. They have properly adjusted the dampers to suit the bigger wheels and its characteristics, to the point where if you drive them back to back, that can feel even more comfortable than the old one. The new 16s feel more comfortable than the old 14s, and that I think is a big improvement. That says a lot about Proton's finesse when it comes to ride and handling. And beyond that, you just have to respect Proton for its constant improvements through the years, the constant moving forward, walking forward, making changes where necessary, because the Iriz, truth be told, has not been a strong seller for the brand. This was originally supposed to be the Myvi killer back in 2014, but that obviously did not happen. Through the years, sales numbers have not been great. The Iriz have always been a very, very slow seller, especially compared to the Proton Myvi, which is the best-selling car in Malaysia overall. So you would have forgiven Proton for giving it less focus, for even maybe abandoning it along the way. But instead they've kept making this car better along the way through the years, through the many iterations, 2017, 2019, 2021 right now, that every step of the way there are significant improvements to be had. So to the point where if you were to drive the original 2014 car with this car even, and then you drive the 2022 car, there are big jumps to be experienced along the way. To me, Proton showing constant effort at improving the Iriz from day one to where it is today deserves mad respects. Now obviously a significant part of a car ownership experience is the whole after-sales service. And this car, I've only ever sent it to Proton Betaling Jaya by Regal Motors, and I've got to say, I've got zero complaints. I've been extremely pleased with the entire service offered here. Every time I need a service, I just send them a text on the main line and I'll get a service slot within the next day or two. Pretty much the only time I ever had a problem was during the whole flood situation 2 months ago, where they had to prioritize flood damaged vehicles, and rightly so. As for service prices, they are exactly the same as what's advertised on the Proton website and the app. But of course, the service center did once or twice slot in a few optional items like an aircon service, which I thought was unnecessary for an 11,000 kilometer service. So I did say no to that, and they reverted back to the standard menu service, which is quite affordable so far. So truth be told, I've been extremely happy with the Iriz service so far. If you do have any other experience that's different from mine, do let me know in the comment section below. I do want to know about all that as well. So over to those of you who are still on the fence between choosing an Iriz or a Myvi, whether you're looking at a new one or an old one, I hope this video has helped you a little bit. Me personally, I do think the Proton Myvi is an excellent product through and through, but to buy one, personally for myself, I still think the Iriz is the one for me over various reasons. First of all, I still think this is a much more individualistic, much more unique option compared to the Myvi, and it looks better both on the outside and on the inside as well. Plus, of course, the Iriz drives just about 5 times better than the Myvi at the very least, and that's not even an exaggeration. I'll tell you what, I think today the Iriz is an even stronger opposition to the Myvi than it was in the very beginning 8 years ago. All the constant improvements, both under the skin and outside the skin as well, and what you can see, this is now the best Iriz you can buy ever. So again, if it was me, I'd still choose the Iriz over the Myvi today. What do you think, however? Do you agree or do you disagree? Let me know in the comment section below. So that's my long-term review of my personal Proton Iriz over here. What do you think of this format? Do you find it helpful, or do you think there are other things that you'd want to know? Let me know in the comment section below. I'll make sure to include them in my next long-term reviews of the X50 and the X70. As you can clearly tell by now, I am a big fan of the Proton Iriz. I think this is a shining star of Proton's ride and handling prowess, and it deserves to be celebrated for that. I am a massive fan of it. I love this thing. So what do you think of this video? Let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching and stay safe, everyone.